This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Hi everyone, you're listening to MENA Talks. My name is Fache. I am a journalist and a consultant for the BIC, the Brussels International Center. And today we are going to talk about the war in Ukraine, from Ukraine, with a special episode recorded between the Donbas region, the city of Izium, and Brussels, where I interviewed Lisa Musiol, who is the head of the EU affairs at the International Crisis Group. Today I'm bringing you with me to the front line in Ukraine, in the Donbas region, to talk with the soldiers attempting to push back against Russian troops. And we will also attempt to figure out what could be next for Ukraine and whether Europe has the will and the means to maintain its support for Ukraine if the war continues for many more years. Now, allow me to take you with me to the region of Bakhmut, where for many months now Moscow has been concentrating all its effort with the help of Wagner mercenaries. In the area around Bakhmut, I was able to join the unit deployed on the front line. The Russian positions are less than 5 kilometers away. Both sides are aiming mortar shells at each other, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold their positions.
Go ahead and enter. Watch your head. There you go. When we have a break, we put the kettle on the stove to keep it hot. When we have guests, we heat more water on the stove. Usually 5 of us sleep here. This is the living conditions of the field.
It's a basement, little more than a hole in the ground. This is where 20-year-old Alexander sleeps with his men.
This is my colleague's bed, and mine is right next to it. It's okay, it's pretty comfortable. In general, we don't have time to change. We sleep with our uniform on.
On the left there is the space where they sleep. On the right there is an area where they're able to store food. They even have a wood stove offered to them by volunteers, on which they can boil water for their morning coffee. Yuri is 45 years old. He is the eldest of the unit and also the most experienced. He joined the army back in 2014 at the beginning of the war in the Donbas between the Ukrainian government and the separatist entities backed by Moscow.
We lead almost an ordinary life, but a life in wartime. We work, we fight. That's our life. We wake up in the morning, we eat, we fight. That's our routine.
These men eat, sleep and fight in the same place, in the middle of a field. There are days where the fighting is very intense and others, like this morning, when not much happens. And it may sound paradoxical, but for Alexander, that's the worst, when nothing happens.
There's also silence, whole days of silence. And silence is the worst thing because you don't know what's going on. When there's fighting, you are concentrated on your task. You're always ready. But when there's silence, you start to relax, you don't pay enough attention, and that's dangerous.
Once they are done with their coffee, they head back to the surface so that they can show me their position. I'm not allowed to explain in detail what it looks like because I was asked not to for security reasons. What I can say is that in the ground they dug a small underground shelter, just big enough for maybe 4 to 5 men to hide inside, and they also dug trenches to hide their ammunition.
Look, we dug trenches in several places to store our ammunition. That way, if we are bombed, all our ammunition will not be hit at the same time. There's gunpowder, there's shells. That's how we do it.
Alexander has just received a radio message from another unit. They spotted Russian troops' movement with their drone, so now the mission is to target the area with mortar fire. They have a few minutes to act. They put on their ballistic helmets and jump into a hole where they have hidden their weapon.
Ready? Fire!
On Alexander's command, his men fire several rounds.
We have enough soldiers, our people are patriotic and ready to fight if necessary. But as far as weapons are concerned, it's true that what we have is not enough.
І все ж таки хотів би, щоб нам давали побільше випиватися, щоб ми собі не могли б не відказувати, їх наказувати, чому вони прийшли на нашу землю.
Russian forces have since claimed to have finally captured the city of Bakhmut after months of brutal fighting, which would be their first significant battlefield success since last summer. 16 months after the start of the Russian invasion, there seems to be no end in sight for the war, despite most of the Western world siding with Ukraine. As I returned from Ukraine, I sat down in Brussels with Lisa Musiol, who is the head of EU affairs at the International Crisis Group, to talk about what Europe's support towards Ukraine has been like so far and what could be next.
Especially since February last year, so since the large-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, we have seen a huge increase of EU support, of course, to Ukraine, and it's in a wide range of areas. Of course, in the very much when it comes to humanitarian aid, as well as support to Ukrainians inside displaced Ukrainians inside Ukraine, as well as those who have been fleeing the countries and resettled in the EU. Then, in addition to that, we have seen very important sort of economic support, budget support, macro-financial assistance that has really scaled up, especially also even towards the end of last year. We've seen a very big macro-financial assistance package. In addition to that, there has been the support to military assistance to Ukraine from the EU side, largely financed by the European Peace Facility, an instrument that is basically reimbursing member states who donate military equipment, including lethal equipment, to Ukraine. Then we have the EU has set up a military training mission to train Ukrainian soldiers on European soil, so mainly in Germany and Poland, with an aim to, at this stage, I think, train 30,000 soldiers, potentially Ukrainian soldiers. And then, of course, the very important part of the EU support has also been the political support and the support that comes with making Ukraine a candidate status for the EU accession. That is something that has already had political, very symbolic effects that were very important for the Ukrainian side, but also has more tangible support, comes with more tangible support when it comes to integrating already into the European Union.
As you've just described, the EU and EU nation support towards Ukraine has been extensive, political, military, humanitarian, economical. Yet, Ukraine is saying we need more. We are facing an existential threat in the form of the Russian invasion, and we need more support still. Is the EU today and the EU member states willing to do more, also namely when it comes to weaponry? We know that there's been an agreement to supply 1 million shell rounds within the next 12 months. Is that significant? Is that enough? What is there that the EU can do to meet the demands of Kyiv, which is basically asking always for more?
Yeah, indeed. I think this is an important point. I think Kiev has always, throughout the last year, always said that more support is needed, and the EU has always been sort of looking at ways to increase that support. So that's something that I think will continue to be the case. Very, very understandably so. The recent agreement that you mentioned is interesting in the sense that the EU is now moving into a new phase of its support, military support to Ukraine, because they are also looking at supporting procuring ammunition for Ukraine. It's an agreement that comes sort of in three tranches. On the one hand, making sure that there is enough financing, so 1 billion euros extra for countries who can donate immediately and additional ammunition to Ukraine. A second step will be then joint procurement, so 1 billion euros of support to help member states jointly procure additional ammunition, which is going to be used to support directly Ukraine and also to fill up the European stockpiles. And the third phase is also ramping up or increasing the EU capacities to produce its own ammunitions and the military capacities. So that's much more sort of a boost to the defense procurement of the EU. And I think that's quite a big departure from what we've seen before. The EU hasn't really been sort of active in this field so far. So for me, this new package shows on the one hand that there is still a lot of willingness to make things happen, in EU foreign policy to move to a new phase and to continue the support even in areas that the EU hasn't traditionally been very active in. On the other hand, it shows also that the way the EU had been supporting Ukraine militarily until now has also potentially some limits. Until now, it was mainly member states donating equipment to Ukraine and being reimbursed for it under the European Peace Facility. But as stockpiles are starting to deplete, there is a need for sort of new ways to support. And we will still have to see how fast the EU can move on that. These can, especially setting up these new policies, new ways of working between the EU institutions and the member states, can take time. There's certainly a will to accelerate this, but we will have to see how fast it can deliver and whether it will be enough for Ukraine ultimately or not.
The challenge for the EU and its member states is to find the right balance, right, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, because supporting, of course, they want to do it as much as they can, but they also want to avoid escalation with Russia, right? They have at all costs to avoid direct military confrontation between NATO and Moscow. So, looking back in the past year, do you think that the EU and its member states did find the right balance when it comes to supporting Ukraine while avoiding escalation with Russia?
Yes, so Crisis Group broadly has taken the line that the EU has managed so far to keep that balance, and it is a very, very difficult balance to maintain. It has supported Ukraine significantly, and it was important to provide some of this support, especially the military support, also in an incremental way to avoid any escalation. Some of the support that the Ukraine receives now in the early phases might have been risky to supply in a large scale because it could have triggered a further escalation. So that incremental support has been really important, while at the same time really making sure to not get directly involved in the confrontation with Russia. And also other areas we've seen that balancing act is setting up the training mission for Ukraine, but not setting it up on Ukrainian soil, but in European member states. So this has been even the first time that the EU has set up a CSDP mission, as they are called, on the territory of EU member states. So in order to sort of really finding that balance and not sort of being actively training Ukrainian soldiers on the ground. So on balance, we would say that certainly the EU has managed to navigate this, and will have to continue doing so going forward.
What's next? Knowing that this conflict has been going on for a year, and it's not gonna probably not gonna end anytime soon. It could last for many more years. Who knows? Are you confident that the EU, both the EU and its member states, can keep on supporting Ukraine, maybe not only at the same level, but at higher levels, as you said, in an incremental way? Is there any reason to be, well, not hopeful, but to believe that this support will last? If the conflict lasts for, say, 5-10 more years?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't think anyone can have the answer for that. It will depend on so many different factors. It will depend on how the war continues to evolve. We will now see potentially an offensive on the Ukrainian side that everyone is looking at. How will that play out? How generally is the trajectory of the war is going to play into that. Also, the broader geopolitical context can play into it, the economic situation in EU member states, what governments we will have in place as well in the EU member states. We will always have elections coming up in across the European Union, and domestic opinions can shift, and that can play a role as well in terms of member state support to Ukraine. So there's just so many factors that it's very hard to predict. So far, I think there was a lot of speculation that over the European winter, with energy shortages, etc., the cracks could begin to show, and we haven't really seen that so far. Of course, there is always going to be negotiations about the level of support, about the new sanctions measures to put in place against Russia, about new policies, and it will always be a constant negotiation. But so far, we haven't seen any major cracks that would really indicate a lack or a kind of reduction of EU support to Ukraine. But certainly it is something that Moscow and potentially other governments, for example in Beijing, might be watching very closely. They are watching and wondering how long the European and Western resolve will last when it comes to the support of Ukraine. Their impression is often that democracies ultimately sort of weaker when it comes to sort of such a resolve and under more domestic pressure. And so that is something that is being watched very carefully, and will be important for the EU to maintain the unity and the support going forward.
A year ago, Brussels abolished tariffs and imports quota for Ukrainian farm products as a sign of solidarity and also as an effort to help Ukraine's economy. However, last April, Poland imposed import bans on Ukrainian grains after a mass protest by farmers there over failing prices. This was quickly followed by similar bans in Hungary, Slovakia, and Bulgaria in order to protect their local agricultural sector. They eventually lifted their ban not long after, a ban that was widely criticized. Politico called it a debacle that made a mockery of EU support for Ukraine. So, is that one of those cracks that seem to slowly appear, or is it mainly anecdotal and we shouldn't make big conclusions out of it?
So, personally, I would think that it's always been quite a big sort of step to support Ukraine with more integration into the European Union, the candidate status. It was always clear that would come with challenges. Integrating a big country like Ukraine that is currently in a war situation into the EU, even short of the full EU accession and membership, which is still very far down the line, there has been certain steps to accelerate integration into the EU. That would always come with challenges. That was clear from the start, and this is one of those, and it will be something that the EU member states will have to negotiate. There will be other things coming up like that. But especially the imports, the farm imports, has been really sort of affecting Eastern European countries, and there was, I think, domestic pressure to sort of address that. Very understandable. We shouldn't forget that, I think, looking at the numbers of support to Ukraine, Eastern European countries, when measured as percentage of their GDP, have been the ones who have provided most of the support collectively, and especially also when looking at, when accounting also for the support that they have provided to refugees from Ukraine. So their support is very strong, and they have been the ones also pushing other EU member states in that direction. So I wouldn't really read too much into this. I do think there will be challenges with integrating Ukraine further and the continued support, and that will come up on other issues as well. But I wouldn't read it as necessarily one of the main cracks in the EU support. That's my personal perspective on it.
Next year, in 2024, we're going to have presidential elections in the US. And already now we have presidential hopeful, or not official candidates yet, but might very soon become, such as DeSantis and Trump, who've already said publicly that they consider that defending Ukraine is not part of the US national interest. So far, of course, the US has been one of the biggest, if not the biggest backer of Kiev. What if in 24 we have another president who doesn't think Ukraine deserves so much a backing, and there is some disinterest in this conflict? Is, in that case, in that scenario, will the EU be capable of stepping up its aid to Ukraine to replace aid that it will maybe not coming from the US anymore?
Yeah, that's, I think, definitely the